Hello, it's good to see you again. I am sitting here after our last visit. I talked about what I thought was missing from modern children's literature, if we can call it that. I gave the example of this book. We picked on this book a little bit, but this is emblematic of many of children's books, especially for what we would say are books for young children, toddlers, infants, and a little bit older, and just how they're banal. The illustrations are often pandering and adolescent, and that in fact is not for children. It's not good for children, and children don't ultimately want it. I also outlined really my 3 guidelines, rules that, like I said, I don't hold them absolutely, because we do in fact own this book, and I flip through it with my children. So I stick to these guidelines, not absolutely, but consistently and generally. And those inform much of the books that I will get my children, the books that I will read my children. And those 3 are, I'll just reiterate them, and then we can talk a little bit more about this, since our last visit was so, there was so much traffic. It was so interesting to so many people. I thought we would delve into the subject a little bit more. So again, the 3 rules I had are the first, illustrations should be good illustrations. They should be interesting and attractive to an adult. These illustrations are adolescent and, again, pandering, and I don't think kids actually like them. I think they like to see beautiful art, beautiful illustrations. The next rule is that if I don't find the book interesting, I don't read it. We don't get it for our children, we don't keep it for our children, and I won't read it to them. And there were actually several people who said, wait, hold on, just because you don't like a book doesn't mean you can't read it to your kids, or your kids couldn't like it. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then the third rule I had is that you don't have to feel like, especially when they're small, you don't have to feel like they have to sit, crisscross applesauce and just listen full undivided attention to you if you're reading to them. Often I'll find that if I'm reading something to my children, it's a few pages of something, or they're also doing something else. They're coloring or playing with cars, trucks, whatever my kids happen to like fiddling about with, and I'll just sit there and read aloud. And again, the advantage of this is you read something that's more interesting. You can read them beautiful poetry. You can read them interesting and articulate prose. And maybe nothing happened other than they heard that beautiful speech and that sort of thing. And that stuff still affects a person. It still sticks with you. And then same thing with illustrations. Really, most of the illustrations I think of were illustrations that I saw when I was a kid, and then returned to those books and maybe read them because I remembered the illustrations, and so I returned to them as an adult. So that's happened several times, and so those are kind of my guidelines. Because there was so much interest in the topic of our last visit, I thought what I would do is, instead of trying to write anything down, I thought I would just kind of flip through some of these comments and comment back on them. I, of course, noticed that right off the bat, many people resonated with the gist of my point that I was making and agreed with me, which is wonderful. There were also a handful of people who saw some point of disagreement with me, or some chink in the armor of my argument, and they said so, and I appreciated that as well. So I thought it'd be interesting, because it's more conversational, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of go through these, just comment on some of them, and just give you kind of a back and forth, instead of endlessly typing back and forth at each other. So I thought that would be a little bit more incarnational, as much as that's possible. Let's see, this says Beatrix Potter illustrations were peak. That's pretty close to true. Let's see. I remember that many Richard Scarry books the many Richard Scarry books from when I was a young kid. Color, form, story, characters, all accessible for a child without being mind-numbing. I totally agree. All of those things can be complex and interesting. You can have detailed illustrations, you can have complex stories and characters, and all of that is still accessible for children. They're not going to get every little nuance, but most of the time when you read a novel, you don't get every little nuance either. You'll notice that if you reread something, you often say, oh, I never noticed that before. Same thing with children. Just because they don't completely grasp the entirety of a story doesn't mean that they don't grasp some aspect of it. Janet Morgan, I so agree about the patronizing effect of so many illustrations today. I can remember clearly the books I gravitated toward when I was little and know what my children love now. And it's always richly illustrated books. I agree. The one thing that modern children's books consistently do is they always emphasize the illustrations. Now, I have problems with the way that's done most of the time, but they do grasp that there's this visual aspect to, because children obviously, toddlers, infants don't read. But that's certainly true. Let's find us something a little bit more. Well, the most memorable illustrated children's books were Jumanji and The Stranger. Never read them. Although I'm sure that's true. My approach, okay, this is an interesting one. My approach was to get them interested in books without filtering on quality as much. I thought as long as we established a reading ritual, all stories will find their place, even mind-numbing ones. And in time, they will hopefully learn to make those selections themselves. Now they gravitate towards popular comic books more than anything, and my soul hurts every time I see a classic put aside. So it's a good impulse to say, well, just give them everything and they'll just work it out. Now your last comment, your last sentence here gives away the error in that. You say, now they gravitate toward comic books and my soul hurts every time I see a classic put aside. Well, what I would suggest is we shouldn't just inundate them with every possible option they could have and then they'll just sort it out. They won't sort it out. You have to teach them how to sort it. This is good literature. This is a beautiful illustration. This is a boring story. This is banal detail. This is an ugly illustration. This is a poorly illustrated work. You have to teach them that. Even if they can intuit some of that, you still, as a parent or aunt, uncle, whoever, you have to give them the principles and particularly the words to articulate the things that back up their intuitions. If they have an intuition but they can't rationalize it, particularly as they get older, they'll just think, well, that's, I shouldn't just hold an opinion just because. But maybe they hold a right opinion and no one ever taught them how to articulate why their opinion was right or why their sensibility about such and such thing was right. So I would just say it's not correct that we should just get them interested in books. We should have a reading ritual, as you say, but just getting them interested in books just for books' sake is not good. The point of books is to elevate your imagination. That Malcolm Guite recently said this, and he said this before, but he felt his purpose in life was to defend the principle that the imagination is a truth-bearing faculty. And I think that's true, but what you have to do is you have to form an imagination. It's like an appetite. If you just give your kids vegetables, meat, carbs, and candy, and just say, okay, well, here's everything, you can have everything in moderation, you figure out the quality and the quantities and all that stuff, they're not going to do that. They're going to eat the candy and balloon up to 1,000,000 pounds and kill themselves. Let's see. So, there we go. I've long held to the philosophical worldview that children are the most oppressed class. That's a little extreme. These modern books, kids' books and movies, are an oppressive slop trough that has replaced a well-balanced diet for their mind and soul. That's extremely put, but I generally agree with the sentiment. I think we just misunderstand children. I don't think it's intentional. I don't think anyone's trying to oppress anyone else. I think people genuinely try and help their children by giving them books like this because they think it's necessary to aid in their development, and it's not. So I think it's just a misunderstanding most of the time. Let's see. Moore's illustrations of The Wind and the Willows are gorgeous. I agree, they're very good. I'm a sucker for the E.H. Shepard illustrations and for Chris Dunn. His are more recent, I think. Well, of course they're more recent, I think. What do you mean? Those are more recent. I really like Chris Dunn's illustrations. Inga Moore's are also very good too. Okay, someone says, I half agree and half disagree. That's good. I agree that a lot, maybe most, of modern children's books are just straight up bad. However, there are also just more children's books than ever before, and there are an awful lot of good ones. I also don't think we can talk about children's books like it's one genre. We need a range of books that become progressively more complex as the child develops, starting with infant board books that should have no narrative at all. I'm lucky to have access to a well-stocked public library, so most of these blah, blah, blah. There's arguably a little bit of a gap in the market, perhaps, for the intermediary stage. Okay, this is interesting. You kind of have everything up front there and some comments towards the end. I agree that a lot of modern children's books are just straight up bad. However, there are also more children's books than there have ever been before. That is certainly true. And I do agree with that. And with just a greater volume, you are going to have just numerically, statistically, you're just going to have more that are poorly produced. They're poor stories, poorly illustrated. So you're right. That is true. Let's see. Children's books as one genre. I kind of agree. I could get really deep into what I think about that. I think it would take too long. It says we need a range of books that become progressively more complex as the child develops, starting with infant board books that should have no narrative at all. Here's where I disagree. So we need a range of books that become progressively more complex as the child develops. I don't think that's true. What happens is, in reality, and we can think about this too, because we easily think about this in the year of our Lord 2026. Okay, we have this range of books that they are more simple, and then they get to more complex. And we are told that that's to represent the development of a child's psychology from a child more simple to more complex adult. Here's where I think that's wrong. First, for almost all of human history, since probably the Victorian era is when a lot of this probably started, just because of technology at the time and economics at the time, this just became something of a market. But for almost all of human history, children didn't have children's books, and they certainly did not have books that were like infant board books that progressively got more complicated, and yet children still developed into good citizens and members of society, into fully formed, rational, charitable individuals. So I think your premise is incorrect, that we don't need a range of books that become progressively more complex. When you're a baby, maybe you're, I've heard it said, this is not technically correct and this is probably off a little bit, but the idea is there that, like babies, when they're first born, they can only see like so far away and they can't see colors and all that sort of thing. But what we don't do is we don't, create a cutout of mommy's face and try and, make an illustration in, a la On the Farm and say, okay, well, this is mommy's face, and then progressively make the illustration more complex until we just take the illustration away and it's mama's face, her actual, flesh and blood face. We don't do that. The natural thing is the child, after seeing a human face over and over again, they get acclimated to the more complex. So we don't reach down to them and try and, again, pander to them and say, oh, well, you need something more simple. No, they need the real thing. They need reality. They need beautiful images. They need to be able to see the wind through the trees and all that sort of thing. They don't have to develop their psychology of what a tree looks like or the poetic power of trees or anything like that by looking at simple illustrations of trees. And same thing with stories. I think that illustration goes for the stories as well, the narratives, that you can start with more complex narratives. I'm not saying read them Lamort Darthur. You could. I'm not saying you should, though. I'm saying you could start with, you can still read a baby, Wind in the Willows, and they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand it, and they're certainly not going to be able to regurgitate it to you. But it's the same idea. So anyway, thank you for your, that is Jimmy Jam 6197. Thanks for your interlocution on that. Here's a good one. Don't forget to cultivate the bottom shelves of your own bookcase with your kids in mind, especially if they're not allowed. There should be some degree of reward for breaking this rule. I'm not sure what rule you're referencing. Oh, I think you might be referencing, they have to ask before they mess with these. And your point is a good one. Don't forget to cultivate the bottom shelves of your own bookcase with your kids in mind. That's very astute. And in fact, for years, the bottom shelf of our bookcase, our bookshelves, are our children's other their books that they're free to. They can look at those whenever they want, and this is actually on that shelf. I don't think we reward for breaking a rule, but if your rule doesn't conform to the reality that kids want to just pick up a book and flip through it, well, then you facilitate. You just create a different rule. And so in my case, the books we saw last time, they need to ask for those, but there's another shelf that they're free to look at those at any time. So that's very astute. There's a lot of people who said that they were illustrators or children's book writers that commented, and so that was nice to see. Let's see. I didn't appreciate what stuff was misspelled. Okay. I think you were talking about this. Small Beatrix. I loved those small Beatrix Potter books as a child. I totally agree. I like that they make the paper where it's thicker paper, so it's not, you can still rip it, but it's much more difficult to do so. So those are great for toddlers and a little bit older. Let's see. Totally agree with this. That's good. Yes. Okay. Here's one. Tim001. I watched a previous video of yours where you mentioned The Wind in the Willows. I've been reading it to my 4-year-old daughter, and yes, she loses interest after a few pages, and that's when I put it down. I'll try the idea of just reading it while she plays. Great advice. Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely true. With our first child, I tried to do that, and I tried to read like a chapter, and it just wouldn't work, and I got frustrated, and I thought, like, hold on, who says I have to read this front to back, so chronologically, whatever. So what I started doing is I just, read a little bit, and as soon as they just couldn't handle it, I just put it away. And Wind in the Willows is a great example of this, because Wind in the Willows, you can pick it up almost at any chapter and just start reading it, because it's one narrative, but the different chapters are disjointed enough where they're kind of like their own stories. And so you can read Mr. Badger or The Further Adventures of Toad separately, and you don't miss anything necessarily by skipping a chapter or just revisiting a chapter itself. Let's see. I think the reason why the art for children's books are terrible is similar to why we have corporate. It's easy to make these minimalist geometric designs. It's easier to get a graphic artist to throw together a few shapes in Illustrator. I can't really speak to that. I don't know anything about how that's done. This kind of goes back into the comment earlier where they said we just have more. There's just more of the supply now, and so you're just going to have a larger numerical amount in the set that's just subpar. And so that feeds into that. So I'd say that's true. Let's see. Have you ever read the Redwall books by Brian Jakes? I would be interested to hear your thoughts. That's Lady Patience K. Yes. And I think I was 8 to 10. It would have been before I was 10. Probably about 8. My mom read the book Redwall to us when we were little, probably 5 or 6. And then I have older brothers that are much older than I am by a couple decades. And they had the Redwall books, or most of them at least. And so when I got to about 8, it was perfect. It was a perfect size, and so I devoured them. I love Redwall. The audiobooks as well that Brian Jakes narrates himself, and there's usually a full cast, are done very well. And most of the things I remember about Redwall are actually from the audiobooks. So I cannot recommend those enough. The only reason why I don't have them is because my brother, who lives just above me, has all of them. So if I ever wanted one, and actually in the last couple of years I read a couple of them, but if I ever wanted one, I just have to ask him to borrow one. Okay, here's one. This says, board books are meant for babies, you know. From a few days old, the first book you picked up is for babies. No, they're not. Board books are not meant for babies. Again, I would just point to all of human history. For 99% of human history, babies didn't have board books, and they developed just fine. Board books we are told they're for babies, but we're told that by the people who sell them. Why are they the expert? So I just disagree with that. That's just not true. And people don't gift board books to babies, to like little tiny babies. They gift them to toddlers and whatnot. Again, that's why I have this, because someone gave it to us for our toddlers. And again, it's just not true. Children do not need board books in order to develop their psychology in any way. I just disagree with that point. I agree with your point about how unimaginative the modern books are. Oddly enough, I devoured many fact books as a kid. So you might think I would disagree. And then they go on to say, but me and my siblings just ate up encyclopedias and history books and that sort of thing. So I did say that this is just like facts, like, baby goat is called a kid, and goats are like lawnmowers because they eat weeds. And that's true. Those are just plain facts. That's a little bit different than what you're saying. So in that, I would just say that I didn't articulate that particular point well, to which I would agree that there is a place for just informational, for learning, that sort of thing. That is totally true. So I will see that mea culpa. Let's see. Someone said my family have thoroughly enjoyed the Great Brain books. That's good. I don't know that I've ever encountered another person who's heard of or read those. And I was very surprised. When I was gifted them, I did not think I was going to like them. They actually sat on our bookshelf for probably a year before I said, I don't have anything else to read, I'll try. And I devoured them. So, they were very good. The boy in them, who is the Great Brain, is just very clever. And so that was interesting. Someone said goats are not like lawnmowers. Lawnmowers do not munch weeds. I agree. As if we're talking about stretching a metaphor, that's stretching a metaphor a great deal. Let's see. Okay, I want to read this because Jade shows up often in the comments. Jade Schaefer said, some good suggestions for me to get my nieces and nephews. I was already planning on getting them Winnie the Pooh, good for you, as well as for myself. I'll also probably be getting them Wind in the Willows. Please do. They'll really, my boys really like the Chris Dunn illustrations. It's kind of expensive to get a copy. I think it was like $45, honestly. But it's this nice big copy. And let's see, you say, I'm about halfway through Galahad and the Grail. I am enjoying it so far. I'm planning on getting in on the pre-order for the next installment soon. At this point, I'm still going through my first read with my children of Galahad and the Grail. I've read it 3 times just on my own. It is so good. One, it's very readable, so it's a very easy read. It's poetry, so it's a thick book, but it's poetry, so you go through it very quickly, and it is so good. I cannot say good enough things about it. Malcolm Geit's new book, Galahad and the Grail. And then, of course, the pre-order for the next installment, I think it's The Coming of Arthur, is already out, and you should get both. And you should get the other 2 when they come out in 2027 and 2028. Let's see. I was worried I was the only one who thought books aimed at children are ugly. I remember liking beautiful artwork even as a kid. I don't understand the logic of most publishers. I think largely when people write books, they want to make money off of them. And that's not a bad instinct. It's not wrong to want to make money. When you prioritize, being able to mass produce something and do so efficiently and quickly, you're just going to have things that they're just going to fall by the wayside. This book is not going to last in my house, and it's not going to last in history. In 50 to 100 years, no one's going to pull their copy of, On the Farm off the shelf and say, oh, I loved this book when I was a kid. No one's going to do that. Let's see. Sandra Boynton and Eric Carle have the next board books. I'll be honest, I do not like Eric Carle's illustrations. I don't know that I'm familiar with Sandra's illustrations. Eric Carle's are kind of the same thing. They're blocky, colorful shapes, and honestly, I never liked them. I never liked the illustrations in like the Hungry Caterpillar. I never liked those kinds of illustrations. Let's see. This says NB. If you'd hate to read I don't know what NB means. If you'd hate to read a particular book out loud, don't get it. You'll do everything you can to avoid story time. I totally agree. You should get books that you yourself enjoy reading. There are a lot of really great illustrations. Someone put in here a list of like 50 to 100 book recommendations in the comments here. And my wife this week, we have a bin that we have all of our library books that we currently have in. And this week I commented that, why are there so many? Because normally we get a handful at a time. And she said, oh, I went through that person's list and got every single one of them. And so we've read through many of those, and I've liked some of them, and we've flipped through some of them, and both my wife and I said, yeah, I'm not going to read this, halfway through, and we put it down. So anyway, that was awesome. Let's see. Great video. I've always felt that young children deserve beautiful, engaging books. I agree. Adults deserve beautiful, engaging literature and books, and that goes for both the content, the substance, and the delivery, and so that's where, it should be. I try and get nice, beautiful illustrations, hardbound, nice cloth or leather cover, quarter bound, something like that. Talk to children's librarians instead of looking at the bookstore. There are some good illustrators out there. That's true. I just have so many that I just gravitate toward. And most of the time I gravitate towards, you should just have a handful of really good books that you can return to over and over again. If you do too much, it's too much. If you have too many options, it's kind of debilitating. You kind of have to fence things in and say, okay, well, we only have these. So I try and pick ones that I can return to and my kids want to return to time and time again. Oh, I think I did respond to this one. This one is funny. So it says, so your children can watch and listen to you read your old books, but they are not allowed to touch because they are too precious. Must be fun for them. And that made me chuckle. I think my wife pointed that one out to me. That's funny. No, that's not what I said. There are some books that they do have to ask. They have to ask before so that, I can be aware that someone has that book out and maybe they need an eye on them every, couple minutes or maybe they need a reminder to, hey, don't forget, be gentle, just, whatever, or go sit down. But no, none of the children's books, none of the ones that I showed you are too precious for them to touch or flip through on their own. They just have to ask. And again, we have the bottom shelf are all the books that they can look at without asking, and there are plenty there. So that's just not true, and it is fun for them. They do get to flip through and look at my books as well. I don't think there's really any of my books that I wouldn't let my children flip through, as long as I was aware of it. Some of them I'd want to be there because they just, you rip a little page and, it's not the end of the world, but if it happens over and over again, you can rip a page out and that can really destroy the pleasure of picking up a nice book. Let's see. This says, I would say the first book you showed was more like a toddler book, not a children's book. Someone pointed out earlier, not all children's books are created equal, which is true. I would just go back to say, this is not a book for toddlers. It's not a book for anyone. No, I generally don't think a book like this, anyone should read. It's not necessary. Toddlers don't need reality dumbed down for them. They don't need banal narratives. They don't need ugly illustrations. No one needs that. It aids no one's psychology. So it's just not a toddler's book, and the other books are children's books in as much as they're for children. But I mean, I've read all of them as an adult, so I would go back to, I don't think there are children's books properly. I think there are just books, and some are suited. They're enjoyable enough to interest the imagination of an adult as well as for a toddler. Someone said, what lucky children you have. I agree. I think they're so lucky. I think they are the luckiest children to have me as their father. Okay, let's see. Someone said, I'm sorry, but you were comparing board books with paper page books. How exactly is my 8-month-old going to flip through that? Those books are more for creating interest visually and for toddlers to learn how to handle books. The text is illustrative. You should make conversation about the pictures with your child. The simple style supports abstractive thinking and association. And it's great to mix it with photorealistic board books to further support it. The first recommended book you showed is suited for 2 years old if handled by an adult, and 3 years old for children. Nowadays, there are so many options. You can introduce cloth books and stating Leporello books since few months old. And okay, kind of losing them on their diction here. The brunt of what they're trying to communicate is in this first paragraph here. You're comparing board books with paper page books. That's true. I was saying that this particular board book and board books like it are just inadequate. They're not for children, and generally speaking, you shouldn't flip through them, and they're just not going to last. That's kind of the main thing. They're just not going to last. They don't aid really in development, as I've explained before. You do bring up a good rejoinder, like how exactly is my 8-month-old supposed to flip through those books? With help. They need your help. Your kids, I'm not saying you do this, but a lot of parents get toys and books and things for kids so that the kids can go do something and the adult can just relax and, not have to be hands-on. That's not a bad impulse. I think it's often a misplaced one. I think if you're tired and you're dog tired, you just want a second, you should still go over there and help flip through a book. You as a parent or as an aunt or uncle or babysitter, whoever, you can do a lot more with kids than you think you can, even when you're dog tired. So you should just do it. 8-month-old kids maybe don't need to flip through books, period. Get them blocks or other toys. Get them, my boys have these blocks or cars and trucks that they play with. It's rare that they'll flip through books, especially when they're 8 months old. That's pretty little for them to understand that this is a book and you're supposed to sit down and kind of flip through. These are pages and you flip through them successively. Like 8 months old is kind of young for that. So maybe they're just too young to flip through a book, period. And again, if they flip through a board book at 8 months old, they're not looking at the pictures, they're not looking at the content, they're just doing something tactile. So give them something else that's tactile. So that's what I would say to that. That is a good rejoinder, like, okay, our conception so much is different kinds of books are for different ages. And again, that's just not true. Books are for forming individuals. There aren't some books that are for a 2-year-old and some books are for an 8-year-old. That's just not the case. There are toys for 8-year-olds and they just need something tactile to enjoy. But that is a good point. There is a disconnect between comparing board books with paper page books. And the difference is you just have to, if they're 8 months to, I don't have any 8-month-olds at the moment. And I don't really recall any of my kids when they were 8 months old, 6 months to a year, were they really interested in sitting and flipping through a book. If they had a book, they were throwing it about or chewing on it. So maybe they don't need a book, maybe they need a chew toy. So you make a good point. You point out that there's this disconnect between our conception of books and, in practice, the position I defended. So, okay, someone said here, this is funny, or it starts funny. It says, "Oh dear, you do not understand child psychology enough to be making this video. 0 to 1 kids need 2 types of books, real life photos and a second type which is exactly like that tractor book. They need high contrast and shapes. That is it. They are learning about extraction and representation around 2, and all art forms will help with that. Between 0 and 2, 90% of the learning is being done with your voice. They are listening. They are picking up your vocabulary. That's interesting. You could sit there with just the text on a piece of A4 paper and they would still learn something. The pretty pictures are just to get them to stare at the book so they concentrate. Also, it gives the new words context. Every time Daddy says tractor, I see something with round circles that looks similar to a car, but it is on a farm. Little kids learn a tractor is a farm car. 3 and up kids like more visually stimulating books, but this tractor book is not aimed at them. Also, for a 1 to 2-year-old, seeing a goat as a lawnmower is extremely imaginative. It's just not in any definition of imaginative. It's a stretched metaphor to say that a goat is like a lawnmower. It's a simile, and it's just stretched to the brink of what a simile could be. My children have never. They help me mow the lawn every weekend when it's appropriate. And I've never once had them say, "Hey, your lawnmower, Dad, is kind of like a goat. Like goats kind of do that." Not once. So it's not intuitive and it's certainly not imaginative. And it's a stretched simile, so that's just not true. You do not understand child psychology enough to be making this video. In as much as I was a child and have children, I don't know that I need a degree to have principles about what books I read my children. 0 to 1 kids need 2 types of books. Okay, this is an interesting point. I appreciate this. They need real life photos and a second type which is exactly like that tractor book. They need high contrast and shapes. That is it. That's where I disagree. And my proof is For, again, 99% of human history, children didn't have books like that, and they still developed, their psychology developed just fine without those. So they don't need them. That just isn't true, and it's borne out by all of human history, except for the last 50 years at least. If we're really generous, we could say since the Victorian period, because that's where children's literature as a genre, I think, kind of started taking shape in the modern sense. But that's just not true. Maybe that's what they can comprehend, but that doesn't mean you can't show them beautiful illustrations, and as their psychology develops as they age naturally, that they'll understand the depths of artwork more and more on a subconscious level. You do make a good point. You say between 0 and 2, 90% of the learning is being done with your voice. They are listening. I absolutely agree. That's exactly right, which is why you should read them poetry. It doesn't have to be, I don't recommend reading T.S. Eliot because most of the time I have a hard time reading T.S. Eliot, but you can read simple poetry. You can read, and actually one thing modern children's books do a lot of the time is they do have very simple like poetry. A narrative will be set in a rough ballad sort of form. So you should read poetry. You should read interesting, elevated, but not complex prose, like The Wind in the Willows. When they hear interesting words, what is it at the beginning? Mole sees the river, and the way that Kenneth Grahame describes the river, this full-bodied beast slipping by Mole. They're picking up on all of that. And so I totally agree with that point. They're listening. 90% of the learning is being done with your voice. Totally agree. You're absolutely right. So you had some great points there, and in some cases I think you're just wrong. But there we go. Thanks for disagreeing with me. Most of the time it's way more interesting to have someone disagree with you because you can go back and forth, and it's always a more enjoyable conversation. No one has to have their head bit off. And anyway, let's see. Someone said, can you take a look at my book and give me feedback? And I said, yes, absolutely. And they didn't say anything. So this is Jules410. I'd be delighted to take a look at your book. You just have to tell me what that is, and I'd be happy to give you feedback. Modern illustrators tend to draw for children the same way modern parents talk to them with baby talk. 100% agree. This is the book and I don't mean to pick on this book. Again, I have this book on my bookshelf. My boys can look at this book, and I've flipped through it with my children. But it's a good illustration. It's a good example. When other people, especially people who don't have children, come and visit us and they'll interact with my children, they'll often talk to them in baby talk. And they don't understand that, you don't have to do that. The point is you talk to them normally, and their vocabulary will elevate to your level. Maybe not right away, but over time. Yeah, that's totally right. Okay, this says, I don't agree. Oh, good. Kids are not small adults. They are different, and their tastes in books can be different than adults. Kids are not small adults. You're right, but they're still human. So adults are human, and they still have human desires and deep-seated needs, and they still have all of the same faculties and potentials that adults have, sometime fully developed, and sometimes adults are still underdeveloped in different faculties like the imagination as well. So I wouldn't talk about it in terms of children and adults. I know I've thrown those words around because that's kind of a demarcation for the content we're talking about. But you're right, the distinction between child and adult is kind of a wrong one. We're all humans, and so we all have a desire and a need and a faculty of imagination which should be cultivated. And I'm just arguing that we don't need to cultivate children's imaginations in a substantially different way than we would cultivate an adult's imagination. That's all. So you're right. I do agree with that. 5 minutes into the video and I start to think you look at these books from adults' perspective. No, I'm looking at it from, like I just said, from a perspective of someone who has a largely formed imagination, who wants to help form the imaginations of my children. They go on, the book you are holding is appropriate for a child below 5. My argument is no, it's not. You have to keep in mind, children's brains are still developing. Children until age 6 cannot determine fiction from reality. If it's good fiction, it doesn't matter. Children can get overwhelmed if there is too much going on in the picture or the sentences are too complicated. I don't think they get overwhelmed. I think you're getting at something correct. So I will agree with this statement. I would just phrase it that children don't get overwhelmed if there's too much going on in the picture or the prose or speech is too complicated, the vocabulary is too elevated. I just think they just won't get it. And my contention is that's okay. They don't have to get every little nuance in a story or in a picture at first glance. That just isn't necessary. That's not how adults operate. When I read a novel for the umpteenth time, I almost always notice something different. And part of the beauty of good illustrations is you return to them again and again, and the same thing happens. Children don't know anything about the world. Please have an open mind and look past the silliness, because it's a wrapper for messages that are trying to get across. Oh, they reference a Bluey episode. I agree. Children don't know anything about the world, and I'm just saying the solution is not to just expose them to drab things. We should expose them to things that actually represent reality, like complex artwork, because reality is complex. When I look at a wall, there's all kinds of shapes and shadows, and reality is complex, so we shouldn't dumb it down for them because we think they can't understand it. We should show them beautiful things for that reason, because they don't know anything. And I'm not concerned about silliness. I'm often silly with my children. That's not a concern. You said now the rules. Okay, so you're responding to the particular rules I outlined. So this is good. You say now the rules. Why not let your children determine for themselves what is interesting or not? They will seek your approval whenever trying something new, and that is a bad thing, or you will discourage them from reading altogether. Chronicles of Narnia is not appropriate for a child below 6 years. Okay, this is good. Why not let your children determine for themselves what is interesting or not? Okay, so I think this is, I want to clarify what I mean by because one of my rules is if it's not interesting to me, I don't read it. What I don't mean is if it's not a particular area of interest, like a hobby or something like that. For example, like I particularly like medieval literature. I like Arthurian literature, Lord of the Rings, stuff like that. What I don't mean is that if it's not something that I would read myself sans children, I don't read it to them. That's not what I mean. For instance, there are books that I have read my children within the last 24 hours that I would never pick up again if they didn't ask me to read it, just because it's not of interest in that way to me. That doesn't mean it doesn't have the capacity to be interesting to a human person. So this is where when I say, if it's interesting, what I don't mean is I particularly find it of interest because it resonates with, preferences or hobbies that I have. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, does this story, does this narrative have the capacity to be interesting? For example, I was talking to my dad and he was talking about the Louis L'Amour books. And I tried to read Louis L'Amour books and I just could not read them. I don't like Westerns. It's just uninteresting. It's not of interest to me. That doesn't mean I think Louis L'Amour books are bad literature. I think they're still good literature because there's many more people. Most people who have read them say they're good. So I can only just rely on that and just say it's just not my preference. So that's not what I mean. So that's a good distinction you're drawing, and that's a good thing to point out that just because it's not appealing to your preferences, don't read it. What I'm getting at is it should have the capacity to be interesting, even if it's not to your particular taste. They will seek your approval whenever trying something new, and that is a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. Or you'll discourage them from reading altogether. That's just not true. For children to seek approval from their parents is a good thing, actually. So that's just not true. And teaching my children to distinguish between this is an uninteresting story, and even if maybe you think it's kind of fun, maybe you shouldn't think it's fun, and then saying this is a good story, even if you don't entirely get it, that's perfectly all right, and that's perfectly legitimate. I go back to the meal analogy. If you stick candy in front of a child, or if I stick yogurt in front of a child, and I stick a cut up steak in front of them and say, okay, which one do you want? They're going to pick the yogurt every time. But the steak is better for them. And so I'll feed them the steak and say, no, you cannot have yogurt now. There's a place for yogurt. It's not now. You're going to have this whether you like it or not. And it's not me being a tyrant or domineering. That's how children learn. You have to teach them some of those things. Sometimes they have intuitions about things, and sometimes you have to instill those things into children. That's just the way it is. Chronicles of Narnia is not appropriate for a child below 6 years. Says who? I don't know why you're saying that. They're not going to get everything. Yeah, that's true. They're not. That's true. Well, boy. That was good. That's good. I do appreciate it because you did force me to, maybe David, maybe you're being overly worried about, the silliness wrapped in this childish message, whatever. Maybe you're overly concerned. Maybe you're being too stringent. And so maybe, articulate yourself a little bit better. And so you gave me the opportunity to do that. So thank you for that. Some of the sentiments are I would just still disagree for the reasons I gave before. So I think we just got through all of those, and many more of you stuck in other comments that I've read through many of them, not all of them dutifully, so sorry. But thank you for engaging with me, especially if you disagreed or wanted me, David, you're not being precise in this way, so maybe try again. And that's perfectly legitimate because I'm not the world's greatest orator as much as I would like to think maybe I am. So thank you for sitting with me. It was such a fascinating topic, and since having children, my opinion on this has deepened and got a little bit more solid in some areas, and I've changed my mind in some areas. So thank you for engaging with me. I hope that gave you something to think about. We have been remiss on, I think, the last couple of visits in reading some poetry. And I just picked this up this afternoon, and I read this, and I thought I might read this. This is Shakespeare's sonnet number 80. And I'll just read this, and then we can part separate ways. So we end on good literature, good poetry, and we can smile and chuckle and go on our way. So this says, "Oh, how I faint when I of you do write, knowing a better spirit doth use your name, and in the praise thereof spends all his might to make me tongue-tied speaking of your fame. But since your worth wide as the ocean is, the humble as the proudest sail doth bear, my saucy bark, inferior far to his, on your broad main doth wilfully appear. Your shallowest help will hold me up afloat, whilst he upon your soundless deep doth ride. Or being racked, I am a worthless boat, he of tall building and of goodly pride. Then if he thrive and I be cast away, the worst was this, my love was my decay." That's Shakespeare's Sonnet 80. Thank you once again for joining me, and thank you for all of you who agreed with me, and especially for those of you who disagreed with me and said something. So it always makes for a much more interesting conversation to to go back and forth when you disagree. And sometimes you kind of come closer together, and sometimes you still kind of remain apart on a topic, and both of those are okay. So it's not the end of the world. Thanks again. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.